Okay, so now we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into the process of actually starting the viewer. So if you think back to what we talked about earlier, where the client is making this request to a server, we're going to zoom in on that a little bit so we understand exactly what's going on. So we talked about REST, and we talked about how the hoop server is listening for these requests. So what happens is that when it comes time to start the viewer, we need to tell the server to please allocate some resources on the server to service this request. And what we do is the only required field is telling it what class of session that we want. What class of session that we want. So we have either CSR, which is for the client rendering, or we have SSR for the server rendering. You can specify additional parameters, but we're not too worried about that right now. So we send this string to the server via a post request, and what we get back is this JSON response. So if you think back, it looks kind of what I said. There's some extra stuff here, but we get the result back which says okay, like the service was created. We get back a service ID, and this service ID is just a unique identifier for this particular session. There's some other commands that we can run on this, but for the most part, for now, we're not going to be too worried about that. We'll look at it a bit later. But just know that this is every session that you create has its own unique ID. And then the endpoints that we get back is what's most interesting to us. So in particularly the WebSocket endpoint, because this is what we're going to feed into our WebViewer object to connect to a streaming service. The HTTP one is used, we can query the status of the system, but for now we're just going to be mostly focused on this WebSocket. So again, this is what we send, and this is what the server is going to respond back with. In the event that the result is not okay, something like serves the capacity or the model isn't correct or something along those lines, we'll get back, the result will be error, and then we'll get an error string there. Okay, so this again just shows us how we would start our viewer. We make a new WebViewer object. Container is our viewer container, which is a div element that we created in our page. The model name, we can also use empty to start with an empty model, or you can just omit it, and it will also start an empty model. The endpoint URI is that string that we got back in the WebSocket string that we got back from the service broker. We'll just paste that right in there. And then the renderer type is how we would set if we want the client or server. They have to match. So if you requested a client renderer, you'll specify a client renderer type here. If you requested a server renderer, you specify the server renderer there. And then you call start, and we'll start streaming that data. So we can take a quick look here at a sample, and this shows the whole thing start to finish. So if you're not too familiar with JavaScript, don't really worry about it too much. But basically what happens here is that we create a new HTTP request, and this allows us to make additional requests within the context of a page. Every time you load an HTML page, you make one request to get that page, and one request for the resources that page needs, like images or anything like that. But an XML HTTP request lets us make additional requests without leaving the page. And then we say, every time you make a request, you get a status. And 200 means the status was okay, as in the request succeeded. For example, if you try to make a request for something that doesn't exist, you get a 404. You may have seen these errors throughout working with the web. So in our case, we parse the response text. So the text comes back as just a string. We're going to turn that request into a JSON object, and then we say, okay, what is our endpoint? Well, it's the endpoint's WS parameter. And if we think back to the previous slide, that string had a endpoints and a WS object, or attribute. So now we know, okay, the response was okay, we turned it into a JSON object, we had to parse that response back, and now we get our endpoint, and we're just going to feed that right into the endpoint URI of the viewer. And we specify our rendering type, and then from there we call viewer start. So this code will execute when our request is completed and it's okay. And that's how we start up the viewer. And you can see down below that this is how we kind of build up this request. So the host name is essentially the domain name of where we're going to make the request to. So on our own machine, this would be like localhost. And then we make the post request to localhost/service, which is the REST API is listening on /service. And then this is the data that we send. So you'll remember this from the slide, that classes we want our CSR. So this slide is very similar to the last slide, except we can specify here, this is how we set that streaming mode that we talked about previously. So streaming mode could be all, interactive, or on demand. So you don't have to, the streaming mode is specified separately from requesting the service. Once you request the service, it can operate in any streaming mode. But once you set that streaming mode, it cannot switch. Okay, and now when you're done using the viewer, you can call shutdown. And what shutdown is going to do is that's going to kill that link between the client and the server. So we talked about how in the case of stream all, we're still going to prioritize that data that you can see, but we will stream everything eventually. If you don't need to add any more models into the scene, you just call shutdown once everything's done. And the client will still be able to fully interact with the model, but they won't need that server connection anymore. So this is a good way to save resources on your server.